The Red Sea does not announce its intentions. It sits between two continents with the particular geographical patience of a body of water that has been a transit corridor for longer than any of the civilizations that have fought over its shores, and it carries its traffic with an indifference to the specific nature of that traffic that has never changed regardless of who controls the coastline on either side. At 2:17 a.m. on a morning in the southern approaches above the Bab al-Mandeb, the surface radar picture aboard the USS Arleigh Burke showed the ordinary compression of a major maritime corridor at night. Container vessels, bulk carriers, tankers on the northbound lane, and their counterparts heading south. The usual distribution of fishing vessels along the Yemeni coastal shelf, and one contact that had been present on the radar picture for 4 hours, and that the Burke's intelligence officer had been watching with a specific and increasingly focused attention since the contact had first appeared at 10:09 p.m. the previous evening. The contact had been logged initially as a medium-displacement cargo vessel, consistent with the dozens of similar hulls that transited this corridor every week. Its AIS signal had been active and transmitting a registration that matched a vessel in the Maritime database with a clean transit history and a cargo manifest that described agricultural equipment consigned to a port in Eritrea. The manifest was the first inconsistency. Agricultural equipment moved through this corridor regularly, but the specific registration the vessel was transmitting corresponded to a hull that the database showed as having completed a port call in Bandar Abbas 18 days earlier. Bandar Abbas was not an unusual port for a vessel of this class. What was unusual was the duration of the Bandar Abbas call, 31 hours. The standard loading window for agricultural equipment of the quantity the manifest described was 6 to 8 hours. 31 hours was more consistent with a loading operation that was either being conducted with unusual care or was being conducted alongside a second, unmanifested operation whose cargo required the kind of attention that cannot be rushed. The intelligence officer had flagged the Bandar Abbas call duration at 10:47 p.m. and requested a signals intelligence query against the contact's recent communication history from the collection architecture that supported the Red Sea Task Force. The query response had arrived at 12:31 a.m. and it contained two elements. The first was a communications pattern analysis showing that the vessel had used an encrypted messaging protocol associated with IRGC, logistics coordination on 3 occasions during its Bandar Abbas port call. The second was a cross-reference hit. The vessel's hull number, resolved from its AIS registration, appeared in a database entry associated with a previous interdiction attempt in this corridor 14 months earlier. An attempt that had been stood down when the vessel had altered course and returned to Iranian waters before the Borden element could be positioned. The vessel had been watched before. It had been careful before. Tonight, it was run in the same corridor with the same manifest category and the same registration, and the intelligence officer had put all of this in front of the Burke's commanding officer at 1:14 a.m., with a recommendation that used the word unambiguous in its second sentence. The commanding officer had read the recommendation and the supporting product and had made 2 calls. The first was to the MH-60R crew that was on alert status in the Burke's hangar. The second was to the strike group's aviation coordination node, which managed the airspace and tasking for the 2 FA-18C aircraft that were currently holding a combat air patrol orbit at altitude 40 miles to the northwest. Both calls had been brief and specific. By 1:30 a.m., the MH-60R was on the flight deck with its crew in the aircraft and its systems running through their pre-launch checks. The FA-18C crews had received a tasking update that redirected their orbit toward the contact's position and briefed them on the surveillance role they would be assuming. The Burke was already on an intercept heading, running at a speed that would bring her to the contact's position in approximately 45 minutes. At 1:58 a.m., the MH-60R launched from the Burke's flight deck into the darkness above the Red Sea. The helicopter was equipped with a surface search radar and a forward-looking infrared system that would allow its crew to conduct a detailed inspection of the contact at ranges that kept the aircraft clear of any weapons engagement envelope the vessel might present. The MH-60R crew had been briefed on the contact's profile and on the specific indicators they were looking for. Deck cargo inconsistent with the manifest, unusual deck activity for a vessel transiting at night, any physical modifications to the hull or superstructure that diverged from the vessel class's standard configuration. The infrared system in particular was capable of resolving thermal signatures that daylight optical inspection could not produce, and a vessel carrying certain categories of military cargo in a maritime environment produced thermal signatures from its storage arrangements that were distinct from the ambient signature of an agricultural equipment load. The MH-60R reached the contact's position at 2:09 a.m. and began its inspection orbit at a range that the crew had assessed as outside the effective engagement envelope of any manpad system a vessel of this class could be expected to carry. The infrared picture it was developing was transmitted in real time to the Burke's Combat Information Center, where the intelligence officer and the commanding officer were watching it on the tactical display with the attention that comes from understanding that what the infrared picture shows in the next few minutes will determine what happens in the next few hours. The first pass produced an image of the vessel's deck that was consistent with the manifest description. Covered cargo, strapped in configurations consistent with agricultural equipment, nothing immediately anomalous in the deck thermal signature. The second pass, lower and at a slightly different angle, produced something different. The vessel's stern section showed a thermal signature that was inconsistent with the surrounding cargo and inconsistent with any agricultural equipment profile in the MH-60R crew's reference database. The signature was compact, dense, and located in a position below the main deck and what the vessel's class specification showed as a secondary cargo hold accessible through a hatch that the infrared image showed was sealed with a different physical configuration than the forward hatches. The sensor operator described what he was seeing in the technical language of his training, and the intelligence officer in the Burke's CIC processed that description against the profile in the intelligence package that had been building since 10:47 p.m. The thermal signature was consistent with the storage configuration of containerized weapon systems whose maintenance requirements produced a specific heat profile from their internal regulation systems. Consistent with was not confirmed as. Consistent with was enough. The commanding officer requested authorization from the strike group commander at 2:22 a.m. The strike group commander reviewed the intelligence product, the MH-60R's infrared data, and the signal's intelligence cross-reference. He authorized the intercept at 2:31 a.m. under the relevant framework for vessels suspected of carrying weapons in this corridor. The authorization was specific about the sequence. Hail, standoff, boarding. The hail first. Always the hail first. Both for the procedural record and because the vessel's response to the hail was itself intelligence about what was aboard and what its crew intended to do about the situation they were now in. The Burke's bridge team hailed the vessel on the international bridge-to-bridge frequency at 2:33 a.m. The transmission identified the Burke as a United States Navy warship conducting maritime security operations, and directed the vessel to stop engines and prepare for boarding in accordance with applicable international frameworks. The response from the vessel was silence for 40 seconds. Then the vessel altered course, not to a stopped heading, not to a cooperative posture, to a course that pointed it toward the Yamana coastal shallows 16 nautical miles to the east, where the water depth would become too shallow for the Burke to follow at any speed above slow ahead, and where the vessel's shallow draft would allow it to run freely on a coastal shelf that provided, in the vessel's operator's apparent assessment, some form of protection. The vessel had also increased speed. Its engine acoustic, monitored by the Burke's hull sensors, had shifted from the transit power setting it had been running all night to something significantly higher. The vessel was running, and the Burke's commanding officer had planned for the vessel running, because the intelligence package and 14 months of experience with this specific transit corridor had made running the most predictable response from a vessel that understood what the hail meant. At 2:34 a.m., the Burke's commanding officer directed the MH-60R to shift from a surveillance orbit to a direct intercept role and to position itself ahead of the vessel's new course to conduct a warning maneuver. The warning maneuver for an MH-60R in this situation was a specific procedure. The aircraft flew a low pass ahead of the vessel's bow at a range that made its presence and capability visible and unambiguous without placing it in a weapons engagement envelope. The MH-60R executed the maneuver at 2:36 a.m., its navigation lights visible from the vessel's bridge as it crossed the vessel's projected course at 100 feet and held that altitude ahead of the bow for 7 seconds before pulling up and resuming an orbit above and ahead of the vessel. The vessel did not reduce speed. It did not alter course back toward a cooperative heading. Its speed, tracked by the Burke's surface search radar, had continued to increase. The vessel's crew had seen the helicopter and had decided that what was behind them was more concerning than what was in front of them. That was useful information. Useful and clarifying. The FA-18Cs arrived at the contact area at 2:39 a.m., having been vectored in from their orbit by the Burke's tactical data link. The lead aircraft had been airborne for 3 hours and 40 minutes and had sufficient fuel for another 90 minutes of surveillance operations before requiring recovery aboard the carrier to the northwest. The crew had been briefed on the contact picture during their vectoring transit, receiving the intelligence summary and the MH-60R's infrared imagery through the tactical data link in a format that gave them the situational understanding they needed before they reached the area. The weapons systems officer in the back seat of the lead aircraft had reviewed the imagery twice during the transit. He understood what he was looking for. They descended from their cruise altitude and established a surveillance orbit above and to the west of the vessel's position at 2:40 a.m. Their targeting pods providing a high-resolution optical and infrared picture of the deck from an angle and resolution that supplemented the MH-60R's view in ways the helicopter's sensor geometry could not replicate. The targeting pod on the F/A-18C was a precision instrument whose design purpose included exactly this kind of persistent surveillance. At the altitude the aircraft was orbiting, its optical resolution could resolve individual human figures on the vessel's deck with enough clarity to determine what those figures were holding, what they were doing, and how they were positioned relative to the vessel's structural features. What the targeting pod was showing at 2:40 a.m. was this. 2 personnel had moved from the vessel's superstructure to the stern deck in the period since the hail. They were at the stern hatch. The hatch was not fully open, but its securing mechanism was in a position that the weapons systems officer described as partially disengaged. One of the two personnel was applying what appeared to be a tool to the hatch's frame. The activity was purposeful, hurried, and inconsistent with any normal deck maintenance operation that would be conducted on a vessel that was running at maximum speed away from a United States Navy warship at 3 a.m. The weapons systems officer described what he was seeing to the Burke's CIC in the specific, measured language of a trained observer whose job is to report what the sensor shows without editorializing. The description was precise. The commanding officer received it at 2:41 a.m. and did not need to ask a follow-up question. The commanding officer directed the Burke to a position that placed her broadside to the vessel's course at a range that put the vessel within the effective engagement envelope of the Burke's deck guns. He also directed the vessel a final order over the bridge-to-bridge channel, transmitted simultaneously in English and Farsi by the Burke's language-qualified officer. The order was direct and left no procedural ambiguity about what was being required and what the consequence of noncompliance would be. The vessel did not comply. Its speed remained at maximum. Its course remained toward the coastal shallows. The personnel on its stern deck continued their activity at the hatch. The commanding officer authorized the use of the Burke's 25mm deck gun to place warning shots across the vessel's bow at 2:43 a.m. The gun system's crew had been at their station since 2 a.m. The rounds impacted the water ahead of the vessel's bow in a pattern that was visible from the bridge as a line of white water crossing the vessel's projected track at a distance that made the message of the rounds as clear as their physical impact. The vessel altered course. Not immediately. With a hesitation of approximately 8 seconds that the bridge team on the Burke watched with the specific quality of attention that an 8-second hesitation in a situation of this kind deserves. Then the bow swung. The engine sound from the hull sensors dropped. The vessel was decelerating. Its stern deck personnel had stopped moving. By 2:49 a.m., the vessel was at minimum ahead on a course that the Burke's navigation team was able to shape through position and communications into a controlled deceleration toward a stop position that the boarding team's insertion geometry required. The MH-60R had repositioned to maintain a continuous hover surveillance over the vessel's deck, its downwash visible on the vessel's surface in the FLIR image as a circular disturbance in the sea around the hull. The FA-18Cs maintained their orbit at altitude, their targeting systems providing continuous deck coverage for the boarding team's situational awareness feed. The VBSS team, the visit, board, search, and seizure element that had been embarked aboard the Burke as part of the Maritime Security Operations Package, had been at readiness since the MH-60R's initial launch. 8 personnel. Their equipment was staged in the well-deck arrangement that the Burke's modified stern configuration provided for exactly this operational profile. The rigid hull inflatable boat launched at 2:51 a.m. and ran toward the now stationary vessel at an approach speed that the team leader had calculated against the vessel's drift and the sea state. The Red Sea at 2:51 a.m. had a low swell from the north, less than half a meter, conditions that made the approach manageable without being placid. The boarding team worked their boat against the vessel's hull with the practiced efficiency of personnel who had conducted this evolution in training more times than they could count, and in operational conditions enough times that the training and the operational reality had become the same thing. The first operator was on the vessel's deck at 2:57 a.m. The vessel's crew, 8 personnel, were located on the bridge and in the engine room in the positions that a crew managing a controlled deceleration would occupy. They offered no physical resistance. The vessel's master, the individual responsible for the transit, was on the bridge and was the first crew member the boarding team's point man encountered. The master's response to the point man's instructions was immediate compliance. This was the response of a person who had assessed the situation with professional realism and understood that the available options had reduced to one. The boarding team secured the bridge and engine room within 4 minutes of the first operator reaching the deck. The intelligence team's representative, the boarding element's most critical specialist for this specific mission, moved directly to the stern hold. The hatch that the F/A-18C's targeting system had showed being worked from the deck was secured but not locked. The activity that the two personnel had been conducting at the hatch before the warning shots had not been a preparation to jettison the contents. It had been a preparation to access them. The intelligence team representative understood this when she saw the hatch's configuration. The seals on the interior brackets had been broken from the inside, consistent with someone having recently opened and resecured the hatch from within the hold rather than from the deck. Someone had been in the hold during the transit and had secured it from inside. She reported this to the team leader before opening the hatch. The hold contained what the MH-60R's thermal signature had been consistent with. The specific category of containerized material that was inside had been assessed and classified by a technical specialist aboard the Burke within 40 minutes of the boarding team's detailed imagery reaching the CIC via the Tactical Communications link. The assessment used language that the commanding officer read with the attention of someone who had been expecting this conclusion and who found, when it arrived, that expectation and confirmation are not the same feeling. He transmitted the confirmation to the strike group commander in the format the authorization framework required. The vessel was taken under tow by the Burke's associated logistics vessel, which had been repositioned to the intercept area during the engagement sequence and arrived at 4:11 a.m. The transfer of custody was completed by 4:47 a.m. The boarding team remained aboard the vessel during the tow. The vessel's crew remained aboard under supervision. The hold's contents remained aboard under seal, documented and inventoried by the intelligence team representative in a process that produced the evidentiary package the subsequent formal proceedings would require. The Burke resumed her patrol position in the Red Sea Maritime Security Zone at 5:22 a.m. The MH-60R recovered aboard at 5:31 a.m. The FA-18Cs returned to their assigned combat air patrol orbit, where they would remain until their fuel state required a recovery aboard the carrier operating 60 miles to the northwest. The transit corridor continued its ordinary business around the edges of everything that had happened. Container vessels and tankers moved north and south through the lanes that international maritime law defined. The fishing fleet along the coastal shelf continued its work. The Red Sea carried its traffic with the same indifference it always had. What was different at 5:22 a.m. from what it had been at 10:09 p.m. the night before was that a specific vessel carrying a specific category of material was no longer transiting toward a destination whose operators had been waiting for its arrival. The wait would continue. The material would not come. The people who had planned for its arrival would eventually receive a communication that told them what had happened, and that communication would begin a different kind of calculation on their part. That calculation was not the Burke's problem. The Burke's problem had been the vessel in the corridor, and that problem had been resolved by 2:57 a.m. with an MH-60R, 2 FA-18Cs, a VBSS team, and a 25mm deck gun that had fired warning rounds across a bow and achieved the result that warning rounds are designed to achieve. The commanding officer logged the operation in the language that operational logs require: precise, factual, sequential, without emotional register. The log was accurate. The log was complete. What the log could not carry was the weight of the particular silence that follows an operation of this kind when the assessment comes back confirmed, and the boarding team's evidence package is sealed, and the vessel is under tow, and the Red Sea is moving south in the pre-dawn darkness, and everything that was supposed to happen in this corridor tonight has instead become something that will not happen anywhere, the corridor held. The watch continued. The Burke turned back to her station and kept her radar painting the water. One contact flagged. 4 hours of intelligence development. 8 VBSS operators. 2 FA, 18 Cs. 1 MH-60R. 16 warning rounds. 0 boarding resistance. The material that was supposed to move through the Red Sea tonight is at the bottom of an evidence log in a sealed container aboard a vessel under tow. The corridor is clear. The mission continues.